Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack a set of ideas that have, literally shaped revolutions and defined modern politics. We're talking about the foundational texts of the left.
So what does it really mean to be on the left? You hear that term thrown around constantly, right? But where did it even come from? What are its intellectual roots? Well, that's what we're going to dig into. We'll be exploring As Armas da Crítica, which translates to The Weapons of Criticism. It's this incredible anthology of texts that really built this political tradition from the ground up.
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we'll look at where the term the left even came from. Then, we'll dive into the big problem they were trying to solve, their critique of capitalism. After that, we'll get into their proposed solutions, the path to revolution. Then we'll see what kind of society they were actually aiming for, and finally, we'll touch on why any of this still matters today.
Okay, first up, the origins of the left. And what's so fascinating is that the whole idea of the left didn't start as some grand philosophy. Nope, the source material shows it all goes back to a specific moment in history, and it's literally about where people sat in a room. So get this, we're back in 1789, the French Revolution. In the National Assembly, you had all these different groups, right? Well, the Jacobins, the real firebrands, the ones pushing for radical change, they all happened to sit on the left side of the room. That's it. It was just a seating chart. But that simple label, the left, stuck. And from there, it just grew and grew into this global shorthand for movements fighting against capitalism and for what they called emancipation.
Okay, so we know where the name came from. But what were they actually against? What was the big problem they were trying to fix? Well, the anthology makes it super clear that this wasn't just about politics. It was a deep, fundamental critique of the entire economic and social system of their time, what they called bourgeois society.
And at the heart of that critique, especially in a key text like the Communist Manifesto, is this idea that modern society is basically split right down the middle. You've got two main groups, two opposing classes. On one side, you have the bourgeoisie. These are the owners. They own the factories, the land, the capital, all the stuff you need to make things. And on the other side, the proletariat. That's the working class, the people who don't own any of that stuff, so all they have to sell is their own labor to survive. The writers here argue that this fundamental split, that's the central conflict that defines the whole era. And this leads to another huge concept in their critique, something called alienation. Think about it this way. For these thinkers, work should be something fulfilling, a way to express your creativity. But they argue that under this system, it becomes the exact opposite. You become disconnected, alienated, from the very thing you're making. You're disconnected from your own potential, and even from the people you work with. Work just becomes this thing you have to do to get a paycheck, not a meaningful part of your life.
Now, this quote is really important because it clears up a huge misunderstanding that a lot of people have. When the manifesto talks about abolishing property, they're not talking about your toothbrush or your car. The target is something very specific, bourgeois property. That means the private ownership of the big stuff, the factories, the corporations, the things that allow one class to employ, and they would say exploit, another.
Okay, so they've laid out the problem, but they didn't just stop at complaining, right? The anthology shows that this was much more than just a critique. It was a call to action, a blueprint for how to actually change society.
So the big question is, how do you actually do it? How could the proletariat make this transformation happen? Well, the Communist Manifesto doesn't just talk in big ideas. It lays out a list of very specific steps.
And here are some of them. We're talking about things like getting rid of landed property, bringing in a heavy progressive income tax, abolishing the right of inheritance, and centralizing things like credit and transportation under state control. You can see the pattern here, right? Each step is designed to do one thing, systematically take economic power away from the bourgeoisie and put it in the hands of a new state that, in their view, would represent the workers. Now, the story doesn't end there. Later on, you get thinkers like Lenin, who, as the anthology points out, added a really crucial piece to the puzzle. He basically said, look, workers are so caught up in the day-to-day grind of just surviving that they aren't just going to wake up one day and become revolutionaries. For Lenin, you needed something else. You needed a dedicated, organized group of vanguard party to lead the way, to educate people, and to bring that revolutionary consciousness to the working class from, as he put it, the outside. So let's say the revolution happens. What then? What's the end game? What kind of society were they actually trying to build? Well, the texts in this collection show a vision that goes way beyond just overthrowing the old system. They're imagining a future completely without capitalism, and maybe, just maybe, without the state as we know it.
And this is where Lenin's analysis gets even more interesting. He argued that capitalism wouldn't just stay the same. It would evolve into a final, highest stage, which he called imperialism. The idea is that competition stops being about little local businesses and starts being about huge national monopolies and massive banks. And what do these giants need? Constant growth. So they're driven to expand across the globe, fighting for new markets, new resources, new territory, which, in Lenin's view, makes global conflict pretty much inevitable.
And check this out. The anthology doesn't just make claims, it backs them up with data. Take this chart on German exports. It shows that their exports grew way faster to countries that owed them money, countries that were financially dependent on them. The point they're making is that finance becomes a weapon. It's not just about loans and interest. It's a tool to control other nations, create captive markets, and project power across the globe.
And this all leads to a really counterintuitive, almost shocking final vision. You might think the goal is to create this all-powerful superstate, right? But according to these texts, that's not it at all. For Marx and Engels, the state is basically a tool that one class uses to control another. So, if you get rid of classes, what do you need the state for? Their answer is, you don't. Once a classless communist society is achieved, the state itself just becomes unnecessary. And, in their famous phrase, it withers away.
Of course, these ideas didn't just get frozen in time. The anthology does a great job of showing how later thinkers took these foundational concepts and adapted them, challenged them, and really evolved them to fit new circumstances.
And that brings us to this incredibly influential idea from an Italian thinker named Antonio Gramsci. Writing from a fascist prison cell, he was obsessed with this question. If the system is so oppressive, why isn't everyone rebelling all the time? And his answer was this concept he called hegemony. He argued that the ruling class doesn't just stay in power with police and armies. They stay in power by making their way of seeing the world feel like the only way of seeing the world. They make their values seem like just common sense.
So if that's true, when can things actually change? Well, Gramsci pointed to these moments he called a hegemonic crisis. This is when that common sense starts to crack. Maybe there's a huge economic crash, or a war, or a massive scandal. Suddenly people start questioning everything, and it's in those moments of crisis, he argued, that the system is vulnerable and real change becomes possible.
So, okay, why are we even talking about all this today? I mean, these are old ideas. But as the anthology makes clear, their legacy is all around us. The very words we use to talk about the world, words like class, alienation, hegemony, imperialism, a lot of that language comes directly from these thinkers. Whether you agree with them or not, they gave us a framework that still shapes how we debate everything from the modern workplace to global power dynamics.
So in the end, what this collection of writings really gives us is a powerful and, a very controversial theory of everything. It's the idea that all of human history is really the story of class conflict, and that the goal of that struggle is total human emancipation. Now, is that idea a framework for liberation, or is it a blueprint for oppression? That's still one of the biggest debates we have, and it leaves us with a huge question to chew on. What is the real engine of history?